Welcome to the Truth in Crime Case Files. On February 5, 2015, the sun had just begun to cast its golden light over the Miami skyline when Isabella Marquez stirred from her sleep. The rhythmic hum of the air conditioning blended with the soft chirping of birds outside. Her hand instinctively reached for the other side of the bed, but it was empty. Leo had already left for his morning jog, as he did every day. It was one of the few habits that remained constant in their increasingly unpredictable life. Isabella sighed, pushing aside the faint unease that had settled in her chest. She forced herself to focus on the day ahead. Sliding out of bed, she padded across the plush carpet to the en-suite bathroom. The reflection in the mirror showed a woman who was every bit as polished as her career demanded. To the outside world, she was the epitome of success, but only she knew the effort it took to maintain the illusion. As she showered, Isabella mentally went over her schedule for the day. She had a meeting with a high-profile client, a local celebrity looking to revamp their beachfront mansion. It was a big project, one that would further cement her reputation as one of Miami's top interior designers. Her work was her passion, and it showed in every detail of the spaces she created. But as much as she loved her job, it was also a source of strain in her marriage. Leo, while proud of her achievements, had grown increasingly distant as her career took off. He often worked late, leaving her to juggle both her professional responsibilities and the demands of raising their daughter, Sophie. It wasn't the life she had imagined when they first married, but she was determined to make it work, for Sophie's sake, if nothing else. After dressing in a chic, tailored suit, Isabella headed downstairs to the kitchen, where Ava was preparing breakfast. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, a comforting start to the day. Sophie, still in her pajamas, was perched on a stool, chattering away to Ava as she doodled on a piece of paper. "Ava, you're a lifesaver," Isabella said with a warm smile as she entered the room. Ava turned, her face lighting up at the compliment. "Good morning, Mrs. Marquez. I hope you like French toast. I made it just the way Sophie likes," Ava replied, her youthful energy filling the room. Isabella's smile widened as she glanced at her daughter, who was grinning up at her with the same bright eyes she had inherited. "You spoil us, Ava," Isabella teased, but there was genuine gratitude in her tone. Ava had been with the family for nearly a year, and she had become an integral part of their lives. The young woman was more than just a babysitter, she was a trusted companion, someone who Isabella could rely on when things got hectic. As they sat down for breakfast, Leo returned from his run, his face flushed from exertion. He greeted everyone with a casual smile, but Isabella noticed the way his eyes lingered on Ava a moment too long. It was a subtle thing, barely noticeable, but it sent a small shiver down Isabella's spine. She dismissed it almost immediately, chalking it up to her own insecurities. Leo loved her, she was certain of that. Yet, as they ate, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Leo was more engaged with Sophie and Ava than with her, and the conversation between them felt forced, as if they were all playing roles in a script they had grown tired of. The easy, affectionate banter they once shared had been replaced by strained politeness. It was a change that had crept up on them slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it had become the new normal. After breakfast, Leo kissed Sophie on the forehead and Isabella on the cheek before grabbing his briefcase and heading out the door. Isabella watched him go, a familiar ache settling in her chest. She had hoped that their marriage would improve once Sophie was older, once they had more time for each other. But instead, they had drifted further apart. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Marquez?" Ava's voice pulled Isabella from her thoughts. The concern in her eyes was genuine, and for a moment, Isabella considered confiding in her. But she quickly dismissed the idea. Ava was young, barely out of her teens, and there was no need to burden her with adult problems. "Yes, Ava. Everything's fine," Isabella replied, forcing a smile. "Just a busy day ahead." With that, she gathered her things and prepared to leave for work. As she stepped out into the warm morning air, she couldn't help but glance back at the house. It looked the same as it always did, pristine, welcoming, a symbol of the life they had built together. But Isabella knew that appearances could be deceiving. Beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form, and she had no idea how deep they ran. As Isabella drove to her office, her thoughts kept drifting back to Leo and Ava. She chided herself for being paranoid, for letting her imagination run wild. But the feeling of unease persisted, a nagging doubt that she couldn't quite shake. She resolved to talk to Leo that evening, to see if they could find a way to reconnect. She still loved him, despite everything, and she wanted to believe that they could fix what was broken. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the sense that something was about to change, something that would shatter the fragile balance they had been clinging to. Isabella didn't know it yet, but the cracks in her perfect facade were about to give way, leading to a darkness that would consume everything she held dear. The sun had not yet risen over Miami when Eva Hernandez arrived at the Marquez home. It was early, earlier than usual, but Eva had promised Isabella she would help Sophie get ready for a school event. Eva unlocked the front door with the key she had been given and stepped into the darkened foyer. The house felt unusually quiet. Eva's footsteps echoed as she made her way to the kitchen, flipping on lights as she went. The warmth of the previous morning was gone, replaced by a cold stillness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She called out softly, "Mrs. Marquez?" "Sophie," but received no reply. It was strange, Isabella was always up by now, preparing breakfast or finishing her morning routine. Eva hesitated, a gnawing worry forming in her stomach. She decided to check upstairs, thinking maybe Isabella had overslept. She walked up the stairs, her heart rate quickening with each step. The second floor was dark, the only light coming from a small nightlight in Sophie's room. Eva peeked inside. Sophie wasn't there. Eva's unease grew as she approached the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of light spilled out into the hallway. She pushed the door open, expecting to see Isabella still in bed. Instead, she was met with a sight that made her gasp in horror. Isabella lay on the floor beside the bed, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. The cream-colored carpet was stained with dark, congealed blood that had seeped into the fibers, creating a grotesque pattern beneath her. Isabella's face was barely recognizable, her features distorted by the violence of the attack. Blood spatter dotted the walls and the bed, evidence of a frenzied and brutal struggle. Eva stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Eva's initial shock gave way to panic. She stumbled back, her hand fumbling for her phone in her pocket. It took her 3 tries before she could dial 911. "Help, please, it's Mrs. Marquez, she's dead, oh God, there's so much blood, someone's killed her, please hurry." The operator instructed Eva to stay on the line and to leave the house immediately, but Eva couldn't bring herself to move. The police arrived within minutes, followed closely by paramedics. The once quiet neighborhood was suddenly alive with flashing lights and the sounds of authoritative voices. The first officer on the scene, Sergeant Tina Morales, gently guided Eva out of the house, her questions soft but urgent. Eva could only nod and stammer as she was led outside, where she collapsed onto the front steps, trembling uncontrollably. Inside, the officers began their work. They cordoned off the crime scene, carefully navigating around the evidence. Sergeant Morales called in Detective Carmen Ruiz, knowing this was no ordinary case. Detective Ruiz arrived, her expression grim as she took in the scene. She had seen many things in her years with the Miami-Dade Police Department, but the sight of Isabella's body gave her pause. It was clear that whoever had done this had acted out of a deep-seated rage, and Ruiz knew that such crimes were often personal. As the police worked inside, Leo Marquez arrived home. He had been unreachable for the past hour, out for an early meeting. When he finally checked his phone and saw the missed calls, he rushed back, confusion and fear written across his face. When he pulled into the driveway, he was met with the sight of police cars and the flashing lights of an ambulance. He barely noticed Eva sitting on the steps as he ran towards the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where's Isabella? What's going on?" Leo demanded as Sergeant Morales intercepted him, preventing him from entering the house. The officer hesitated, searching for the right words. "Mr. Marquez. I'm sorry. Your wife, there's been an incident." Leo's face went pale as he pushed past the officer, his voice rising in desperation. "What do you mean, an incident? Where's my wife? Where's Isabella?" Detective Ruiz stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. "Mr. Marquez, I'm Detective Carmen Ruiz. I'm afraid I have some very bad news. Your wife has been found dead in your home. We're doing everything we can to find out what happened." The words hit Leo like a physical blow. He staggered back, his legs giving out beneath him as he collapsed onto the ground. His cries of anguish echoed through the quiet suburban street, a raw, primal sound that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion, but were quickly ushered back by police officers, their curious gazes filled with a mix of fear and sympathy. As Leo was led away to be questioned, the police continued their work inside the house. Detective Ruiz directed the forensic team to begin their examination of the scene, knowing that every minute counted in a case like this. Outside, Ava sat numbly on the steps, her mind replaying the grisly scene over and over. She couldn't understand how something like this could happen to a woman like Isabella, someone so full of life and promise. But as she sat there, a sinking feeling began to take hold. This was just the beginning of something much darker than any of them could have imagined. But for now, all anyone could do was try to make sense of the senseless violence that had shattered their world. And as the police worked to piece together the events of that morning, one thing was becoming clear: the murder of Isabella Marquez was not a random act of violence. It was something far more personal, driven by motives that would soon come to light. Detective Carmen Ruiz wasted no time. As soon as the forensics team completed their preliminary work, she began her investigation. Ruiz was a seasoned detective, known for her sharp instincts and relentless pursuit of justice. She had solved countless cases in her career, but something about this one felt different. There was an intensity to the violence, a deep-seated rage that hinted at betrayal and heartbreak. She suspected that whatever had led to Isabella's murder was rooted in the dynamics of the family. Leo sat across from Ruiz in a sterile, gray-walled interrogation room at the police station, his face pale and drawn. He was still reeling from the news, his mind struggling to process the reality of Isabella's death. Ruiz studied him carefully, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the nervous fidgeting of his hands. "Mr. Marquez, I know this is difficult," Ruiz began, her voice calm but firm. "But I need to ask you some questions about your wife. Did she have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt her?" Leo shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No. Isabella was loved by everyone. I can't think of anyone who would do this." But Ruiz could sense there was more he wasn't saying. "What about your relationship? Was everything okay between the two of you?" Leo hesitated, and in that brief pause, Ruiz saw the truth. We've had our problems," he admitted, his voice cracking. "But nothing that would lead to this. We were trying to work through it." Back at the Marquez home, the forensic team was combing through every inch of the crime scene. Blood spatter patterns were meticulously analyzed, and fibers from the carpet were collected. Detective Ruiz was particularly interested in the evidence around the bed. The signs of a struggle were clear. Isabella had fought back. The initial autopsy report confirmed what Ruiz suspected: Isabella had been struck multiple times with a blunt object, likely in a fit of uncontrolled rage. The lack of forced entry indicated that the attacker was someone Isabella knew and trusted. Ava was also questioned extensively. She was the one who had found Isabella's body, and her presence in the house raised immediate questions. Although she was visibly shaken and cooperative, Ruiz couldn't ignore the fact that Ava had been a constant presence in the Marquez home, a young, attractive woman in the proximity of a troubled marriage. As Ruiz pieced together the timeline, Ava's alibi seemed solid, but something still nagged at the back of her mind. The relationship dynamics in the Marquez household were becoming increasingly complex, and Ruiz knew that beneath the surface, there was a dark secret waiting to be uncovered. Ruiz knew that in cases like this, the truth was often buried beneath layers of deceit, and she was determined to uncover it. The first person she focused on was Leo Marquez. Despite his grief-stricken demeanor, there were inconsistencies in his statements that Ruiz couldn't ignore. Leo's alibi for the night of the murder was shaky at best. He claimed to have been at a business meeting, but there were gaps in his timeline that didn't add up. Ruiz suspected that he was hiding something that could be crucial to the investigation. Then there was Ava Hernandez. Ruiz had spoken to her several times, each time probing deeper into her relationship with the Marquez family. Ava was clearly distressed, but there was an undercurrent of something else in her demeanor, a mix of guilt and fear. She had been close to Isabella, almost like a daughter, but there was no denying the tension that had existed between her and Leo. As the days passed, Ruiz's suspicion towards Ava grew. There were rumors circulating in the neighborhood, whispers about an inappropriate relationship between Leo and Ava. The idea had crossed Ruiz's mind, but she needed proof. To get it, she decided to confront Ava directly. Ruiz brought Ava in for another round of questioning, this time focusing on her relationship with Leo. Under the pressure of Ruiz's relentless questioning, Ava finally broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed to an affair with Leo. It had started innocently, she insisted, late-night conversations, shared confidences, but had quickly escalated into something more. "I never meant for it to happen," Ava sobbed, her voice trembling with regret. "I loved Isabella, I really did, but Leo, he made me feel special, like I mattered." Ava's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation. It provided a clear motive for jealousy and betrayal, but it also complicated matters. Ruiz couldn't be sure if Ava was telling the whole truth or if she was trying to cover for someone else, possibly Leo. With Ava's confession, Leo became the prime suspect. Ruiz brought him in for further questioning, confronting him with Ava's claims. Leo denied everything at first, but as Ruiz laid out the evidence, the discrepancies in his alibi, the nature of his relationship with Ava, his defenses began to crumble. "It was a mistake," Leo finally admitted, his voice hollow. "I never wanted it to go this far. I loved Isabella, but things between us were falling apart." Despite Leo's confession, Ruiz wasn't convinced that the affair alone was the motive for murder. There was still something missing, a piece of the puzzle that hadn't yet surfaced. Ruiz knew that the truth was close, but she also sensed that the most shocking revelations were still to come. As Ruiz left the interrogation room, she couldn't shake the feeling that both Leo and Ava were hiding something. The affair was explosive, but it didn't fully explain the brutal nature of Isabella's murder. That breakthrough came in the form of a piece of overlooked evidence, a small, blood-stained envelope found in a drawer in the master bedroom. It had been hidden beneath a stack of old letters, its contents undisturbed. The forensics team had initially missed it during their first sweep of the scene, but when Ruiz had the house searched again, it finally surfaced. Inside the envelope was a note, hastily scrawled in Isabella's handwriting. It was brief but damning, hinting at a discovery that Isabella had made just days before her death. "Leo, I know what you've been doing. We need to talk tonight. No more lies." Ruiz felt a chill run down her spine as she read the note. Isabella had found out about the affair, and she was planning to confront Leo. But what had she uncovered beyond the affair? Ruiz felt certain that there was more to this letter than met the eye. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Ruiz revisited Ava's statements. Under renewed pressure, Ava's story began to unravel. She admitted that she and Leo had talked about ending the affair, but there was something else, something she had been too scared to mention before. Isabella had been suspicious for months, Ava revealed. She had noticed changes in Leo's behavior, and she had caught Ava and Leo in compromising situations more than once. But what Ava hadn't told the detectives was that Isabella had recently started digging into Leo's financial affairs. She had found discrepancies, hidden accounts, and unexplained transactions. Isabella had been gathering evidence, preparing to confront Leo with proof that went beyond the affair. Ava was terrified that Isabella's discovery had pushed Leo over the edge. He was desperate, Ava confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. He thought she was going to leave him, take Sophie, and expose everything. He couldn't let that happen. Armed with this new information, Ruiz confronted Leo once more. This time, the pressure was unbearable. Faced with the damning evidence, the note, the financial discrepancies, and Ava's testimony, Leo's calm facade began to crack. Under intense questioning, Leo finally broke. He confessed to confronting Isabella the night of the murder. They had argued, and when she threatened to leave him and take everything, he snapped. The rage and fear that had been building for months finally erupted, leading him to commit the unthinkable. "I didn't mean to kill her," Leo sobbed, his voice choked with regret. But she wouldn't stop, she wouldn't listen. Just as Ruiz felt she was closing in on the truth, another twist emerged. Ava, feeling the weight of her guilt, came forward with one final revelation. She had known about the murder before she found Isabella's body. Leo had called her in a panic, begging her to help him cover it up. Ava had tried to stay silent, but the guilt had eaten away at her. This confession shifted the investigation once again. Ruiz now had two people who were deeply implicated in Isabella's death, and both were trying to protect themselves. But as Ruiz looked at the two suspects, she realized that even now, there were still lies being told. With Leo Marquez's confession and Eva Hernandez's additional testimony, Detective Carmen Ruiz felt she finally had enough to make her move. The evidence was overwhelming: Leo's financial deceit, his explosive argument with Isabella on the night of the murder, and Eva's knowledge of the crime before the body was discovered. It was time to bring them both in. Leo was arrested at his home in the early hours of the morning. He didn't resist, his face ashen as he was handcuffed and led to the squad car. The weight of his actions seemed to have crushed whatever remained of his spirit. Eva, on the other hand, was arrested at her apartment, where she had been living since the murder. She was trembling, her eyes red from sleepless nights and constant tears. As they were taken into custody, the media frenzy erupted. Reporters clamored for details, and the story of the tragic love triangle that led to a grisly murder dominated the headlines. But for Ruiz, this was far from over. She knew that the legal battle ahead would be just as grueling as the investigation. The trial of Leo Marquez and Eva Hernandez captured the nation's attention. Leo was charged with first-degree murder, while Eva faced charges of being an accessory to the crime and obstruction of justice. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a man who, when faced with the collapse of his double life, chose to silence his wife in a fit of rage. They highlighted the financial fraud that Isabella had uncovered, which had driven Leo to the breaking point. Leo's defense team tried to argue that the murder was not premeditated, pushing for a lesser charge of manslaughter. They portrayed Leo as a desperate man who had made a terrible mistake in the heat of the moment. But the prosecution's evidence was damning. The note Isabella had written, Leo's confession, and Eva's testimony about his frantic call after the murder all pointed to a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Eva's defense centered around her claim that she had been manipulated by Leo. She admitted to the affair but insisted that she never wanted Isabella to die. She painted herself as a vulnerable young woman, caught in a situation she couldn't control. After weeks of emotional testimony, forensic evidence, and legal arguments, the jury finally reached its verdict. Leo Marquez was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Eva Hernandez was found guilty of being an accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. However, her sentence was lighter, 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5. The court recognized her as a secondary participant, swayed by Leo's influence, but still responsible for her actions. As the trial concluded, the Marquez family was left shattered. Sophie, now living with Isabella's sister, would grow up without both of her parents. Detective Ruiz, though satisfied with the outcome, couldn't help but feel a lingering sadness. Another family torn apart by secrets, another life lost to violence. But she knew that the truth had finally been uncovered, and justice, however painful, had been served. A Truth in Crime Case Solvers. Interested in more real-life murder mysteries? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Do you have any thoughts about this case or have a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Until then, stay safe.